I don't think anybody, sorry, yes? Sure, come on down, get it. Okay, good news is no one got question 1 wrong. So everybody got question 1, that was good. Question 2, surprisingly, I'm guessing probably close to half did not get this one correct. So look, question 2, base and exponent, they are clearly floating point numbers. So you had to use some kind of floating point type, right? So either double or float. They're alphabetized by last name. They're alphabetized by last name. Right? Double is probably the most appropriate choice here. If you picked float, then when you write your literals, you need an F after the literal. Otherwise, it's not a float literal in Java. So there were a small number of students who tried to use float. Right? If you use double, there's nothing after the literal. There is no exponentiation operator in Java. Right? You have to use a method. So you have to call math.pow. Whether you called it something else, it had to at least look like math.pow. And it had to be called correctly. Right? So base and then exponent. Next question. You have to write a little if statement. Right? So in Java, so in Python, it's x is 0 less than x less than 5. In Java, you can't chain the comparison operators together. So you have to split it into 2. Right? So that's x is greater than 0 and double ampersand. Right? X is less than 5. Right? To throw the exception, it's throw new, and then the name of the exception type, and then round bracket, round bracket. So this question here uses, it explicitly says use a for each loop. Right? So the most common mistake here was that you didn't, students didn't use a for each loop or could not correctly write the for each loop. Right? And so you create a variable for the sum. The for each loop, right, just looks like that. So it's for each element in the list T, right? So type, name of the variable, colon, for in, and then the name of the list or array that you want to iterate over. Right? By far the most common mistake here was to not use a for each loop. Okay, the next one says use a Java counting style loop. So here you had to use a quote unquote regular for loop, or you had to switch to, sorry, let me get rid of this taskbar, the ribbon. Go away, please. No, come on. Oh, wait, why is it not going away? Show tabs. There we go. Okay. It also says that this is an array list. Right? So one of the other most common errors on the quiz is confusion between an array and array list. Right? They are two distinct things in Java. Right? So if this one says use an array list, you have to use an array list. Right? So for an array list, the size of the list is the size method. Right? It's not length, it's size. Right? To get an element out of the list, right, it's the get method. So you have to do tGetI. Right? You're comparing strings, so you must use equals to compare the strings. Right? You can't write equals equals in this case. You have to use the equals method to correctly compare strings for equality. And finally, or is double bar. Although most students got that part, no problem. Right? The most common problem here was writing t square bracket I and using equals equals to compare the strings. Oh, and using length instead of size for an array list. Okay, so this is the floating point question. So in all of these questions, for both of these questions here, the first thing that you need to do is you need to take the floating point number and write it out into its standard format, right? So here, 3-digit significand, 1-digit exponent, right? So whatever number I give you, you just write it out using 3 digits, right? So 4.5 is just 450 times 10 to the minus 2, right? So that's your quote-unquote standard floating point formatted number, right? 1 alp is just 1 digit in the last place, right? So that 0, you want a number that's different than 450 by 1 in the rightmost position of the number, right? So plus or minus 1, right? So that's 451 times 10 to the minus 2, or 449 times 10 to the minus 2. The next question is, again, it's the exact same thing, right? You take your numbers and you write them out in the quote-unquote standard format, right? So 103 is 103 times 10 to the 0. Now this question says use one guard digit. So you get a decimal place and one more digit after the decimal place, right? Now if you're asked to subtract 8.86, again, you write it out in its standard format, but you make sure that the exponent, that 0, the exponent on the, there has to match the exponent on the first number, right? Because the first number is larger, right? So it's 8.8 times 10 to the 0. You can write 8.9 times 10 to the 0 too, that's fine, right? You can't write 8.86. You don't have two guard digits, you only have one, right? So you only get one digit after the decimal place. Do your subtraction, it's 94.2. This is the get back method. So you're given an array, right? You're given a negative index. You're asked to return the element of the array corresponding to that index, right? Where the negative index is like a Python index. Right? So public, static, it returns an int because you're told it's an array of int here. So it returns an int. It has two inputs, right? One is an index, so there's your index, right? One is an array, so there's your array, right? Again, the most common error here is using an array list instead, or using some kind of hybrid between an array or an array list, right? So it's an array, so it's int square bracket ARR, right? Now to get the element corresponding to a negative index, if you just scribble out some examples, it should become very obvious what the answer is, right? So -1, that corresponds to the last element in the list, right? In the array, sorry. So the index of the last element in the array is the length of the array minus 1, right? -2 is the second last element in the array. So that's the index of that element is the length of the array minus 2, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? And so the index of the correct element is just the length of the array plus the index, right? Not minus the index because the index is negative. Right? And that's it, right? Again, most common error here is using an array list. Some students use the loop for some reason, which doesn't make any sense, right? You're trying to get one element out of the list, out of the array, and you can compute the index of that element. Question 4, count the number of spaces in a string, right? Ignoring, and if you have adjacent spaces, consider that to be one space. The part about the adjacent spaces equals one space, I didn't really care if you got it perfectly correct, right? I just wanted to see a reasonable attempt at the answer, right? It's actually somewhat tricky to get this perfect, right? There's many ways to write this. Okay, so count the number of spaces, so that has to return an int, right? So you need to write int here, right? The input is a string, so there has to be big string S here, right? That's your input. N is going to be the number of spaces in the string, right? So it's going to start out at 0. I'm just going to count. I'm just going to iterate over the characters of the string. Right? So ignore this part up here and look at the for loop. Right? So the for loop, I'm going to start at index 1, right? So I'm going to start looking at the second character in the string, right? The ending index for a string is always the length of the string minus 1. So the loop has to run as long as I is less than the length of the string, right? Length of the string is s.length, right? I want to look at the character at index I, right? So to get the character at index I, that's car at I, right? So s car at I, that's a character, right? It's a car. It's not a string, which is one of the common errors on this question, right? It's a character, so it's primitive. To compare two primitive values, it's equals, right? It's not dot equals in this case, which was another, wasn't super common. A few students tried to use equals, right? A character is delimited by single quotes, not double quotes, right? So single quote, space, single quote. So is the character at index I equal to the space, right? Now to deal with the adjacent spaces, you have to look at either the next character or the previous character. So I'm going to look at the previous character, right? The previous character is the character at index I minus 1, right? So to count this as a space, I need to make sure the previous character is not also a space. So not equals to the space, right? So If the character at index I is the space and the character at index I minus 1 is not a space, right, increase the count by 1. Right? Now I have to go back and deal with the first character, right, because I skipped over the first character here. Right? The reason I skipped over the first character here is because of this index, I minus 1. Right? If I start the loop at 0, then I minus 1 is no longer a valid index for the first loop iteration. Right? So you either need an if statement in here to deal with the I equals 0 case or something else. Right? I'm going to deal with it up here instead. Right? So if the first character in the string is a space, well, I've got one space. Right? And now I will deal with adjacent spaces in the rest of the, with the remainder of the loop. Right? I don't care if you wrote if the string is empty or not. I just wrote it here because that was the way the answer came to me for the first time. Right? So this is here to make sure that the if scar at 0 doesn't throw an exception. Right? If the string is empty, then you shouldn't do anything because an exception will be thrown if you try to access a character of the string. I didn't actually check for this condition on your quizzes. Right? So if someone's loop blows up because there's no characters in the string, I didn't care. Right? Of course, in practice, you would care. Right? And so that's it for that question there. Right? Really, what I'm looking for is that, right, and the count. Right? So can you access a character out of a string using char at? Hopefully, yes. Right? A lot of students use square brackets. Can't do that in Java. Right? You can do it in Python. Can't do it in Java. Right? Have to use char at to iterate over a string. There is another way to do it. So someone knew that there was a method that converts a string into an array of char. And so you could also do it that way, right? Convert it into an array of char by calling a method and then iterate over the array. So I think that person got the question more or less correct. And finally, the last question. So this one's make a list. So make a class. Some students didn't make a class. Right? The class has a main method. Some students didn't put in a main method. Right? Okay, so if you make a class in the main method, that was actually 2 marks out of the 10. Public class, some class name, public static void main, blah, 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 blah. That's 2 marks. Right? Step 1, make an empty array list of integer. So there's my class. Right? There is my main method. Right? There's my array list. Right? So array list, angle brackets integer, name of the list equals new array list. Right? Not an array again, right? So again, another common error here is the confusion between an array and an array list. Step 2, add the values 1 through 10 to the list. So here, the most appropriate thing is to use a loop. Right? Some students wrote 10 lines of code, right? T.add1, T.add2, and so on and so on and so forth. You got a comment saying you should use a loop, but you didn't lose any marks. Right? So you want to start counting at 1, not 0, right? 1. You want to count up to and including 10, so less than or equal to 10. Right? You can write 0, I equals 0, I less than 11, or I less than 10, but you have to remember to add 1 back to I when you add it to the list. Right? To add to the list, it's T.add I. Okay. Step 3, swaps the first element of the list with a randomly selected element from the list. Then swaps the second element of the list with a randomly selected element from the list. Right? Then swaps the third element of the list with a randomly selected element from the list. Right? So here, there's an indication that you need some sort of random number generator. I think I even told you, yes, Java util random, right? So you've got this class called random. It's got this method nextInt that returns a random int. Right? So make your random number generator. Right? You should do it before the loop. You can do it inside the loop, but it's wasteful. Right? You don't need a new random number generator every time through the loop. Right? If you made the random object inside the loop, I've got an arrow showing you should do it outside. You didn't lose any marks. Now write your loop. So I want to loop over the elements of the list, right? Starting at index 0. Right? Each time through the loop, I want to pick a random element from the list. Right? So how do I pick a random element from the list? Well, I just pick a random index, and I grab that element. Right? So J is my random index. Right? Ask the random number generator for an integer value, right? Between 0 and the size of the list. You can write 10 here, that's fine. right? Between 0 and 10, the way the method works is it gives you back a number between 0 and 9. Right? So I'm going to swap the element at index I with the element at index j. Right? Now to swap, right, you need a temporary variable, right, to hold one of the elements because you're going to change it when you do the swap. Right? So I'm going to remember the element at index I, right? And now I'm going to change the element at index j. So the way to, and then change the element at index I. Right? To change the element at index I, it's set. Right? So t set, element at index I, what do I want to change it with? I want to change it with the element at index j. How do I get the element at index j? It's t get j. Right? Finally, you can now set the element at index j. Right? So t set j, what value do I set it to? The old value of the element at index I, which is in temp. Right? You can't just write t get I here because you've just changed the element at index I. Right? So if you write that there, you end up with two copies of the same number. For me, the most surprising part about this question is that the vast majority of students can't swap two elements of a list, right? Which was surprising to me. But I don't know. So there's no way you can write a sorting algorithm without swapping two elements. And you're supposed to learn sorting in your previous course. So I'm not sure what's going on here. Any questions about, any specific questions, not about the marking? Well, I guess you can, I mean, not about marking your specific quiz, but about any of the questions in general. So if you have a specific question about the marking of the quiz, you have to come find me either after class today or during office hours, and then I will look at I will reassess your quiz and answer your questions. Okay, any other questions about the quiz? Okay. So today's lecture, we're supposed to be talking about classes, but I need to tell you how to document your class, because we haven't talked about that yet, and your assignment asks you to do so. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go through a couple of slides from the next deck of slides, and then I'm going to go into Eclipse, and I'm actually going to do part of your assignment for you, or with you, right now, right, to show you how to do this. Well, just a little bit. Okay, documenting. So in 121, you should have been shown how to document code. Exactly how you did it, I have no idea, because there's no standard format for documenting code in Python. Right? There's lots and lots of different ways to do it. In Java, it's different. So in Java, there is a standard accepted way to document your code. And every Java programmer is going to expect you to document your code this way. Right? Documenting code is not a new idea. Right? It's existed since the dawn of programming. Java was arguably the first major language, though, that said, hey, look, we're going to put the documentation for the code in the code itself. We're going to run a separate program to extract that documentation and produce a lovely document for you. The tool that reads the comments in your code and produces the documentation document is called Javadoc. So the way Javadoc works is it scans your code and it looks for special comments. These comments are called doc comments. Right? And so the doc comments, they look like the following. So it's any comment that starts with /** and ends with */*. Right? Now remember in Java, the multi-line comment starts with /**. Right? So /** is a multi-line comment that happens to indicate a Javadoc comment. Right? If you know what HTML is, then you are allowed to use a subset of HTML in your Javadoc. You can't use the whole HTML specification. Right? So it's only a very small amount of HTML that you can use. If you don't know what HTML is, we don't care. Right? Don't worry about it. Every Javadoc comment gets split, basically there's two major parts, right? There's some text that describes the thing you're documenting, right? So there's a description. And then there's these things called block tags, right? So you've got a description, and then you've got some tags that describe other things, right? Which I'll explain in just a second. Right? So when you document your code, right, the very first thing in a Java program that you typically document is the class itself. Right? And so every Java program lives inside of a class, right? And therefore, it makes sense that you want to document the class. Right? Now, For the class documentation, you want to describe, what do I tell you? Okay, for the class documentation, you want to describe what is the purpose of this class, right? If you look at the Java standard library documentation, the descriptions of the classes tend to be very long, right? And that's because many, many, many people are going to be using these classes, and it's important to convey the information about what this class, exactly what this class, its purpose is. Right? For the classes that you write in this course, you don't have to write so much for the description of the class. Right? So if I'm making a point class, right, this class represents a two-dimensional point, right, like you learned in algebra. Right? And so probably this description is probably too short, but it's sufficient for our purposes now. Right? So the class point2 is just a Cartesian point in 2 dimensions. It has real coordinates. Right? So it's got an x and a y coordinate. Right? You can go on and explain, you know, what the class lets you do, right? It lets you make a point, you can change the coordinates of the point, and so on and so on and so on, right? And that's what you would write in professional level documentation. So you want to comment at the beginning of your class, right? I'm just going to skip ahead quickly because I'm going to actually show you how to do all this just in just a second, right? If your class has a variable that's also public, then you should describe what that variable, what the purpose of that variable is. Right? So here's the math class from java.lang. Right? The math class has a variable called pi, right, that represents the mathematical constant pi. Right? So it's a public static final constant. Right? If you look at the description for pi, it's this. Right? So inside the source code for the math class, there's a Javadoc comment that looks exactly like this. Right? Value pi is the double value that's closer to any other value to pi. Right? So you want a description of what your of every variable looks like. Right? If you go and look at the documentation for the math class, right, you see this. Right? So the text that you put here, right, ends up being the text that appears in the summary section here. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead to the methods. Oh wait, no, I guess I can't. Okay, we haven't talked about constructors yet. So that was supposed to be the topic of the original topic of today's lecture, right? If you have a constructor in your class, if you don't know what a constructor is, don't worry about it, right? It looks like a method, right? You should document what that constructor does, right? So you put a Javadoc comment there. So here's my constructor for the no argument, here's my no argument constructor for the point2 class, right? So the description says that it initializes the coordinates of the point to 0, 0. Right? Notice the 0, 0 looks funny, right? It's got this brace, it's got a brace here, it's got at code, right? And then it's got the bracket 0, comma 0, right? This at code thing here inside of braces tells Javadoc to format that text using a fixed space font, right? So it looks different than the rest of the text, right? So right here, oh, sorry, let me jump ahead here. Okay, so if you go and look at the description here, it says initializes the coordinates of this point too, and then notice that the font here is different, right? It's in a fixed width font, right? So that looks like a computer font, right? Something you'd see in your text editor, right? Whereas the rest of the text looks like something you'd read in a book. Right, so that's what the purpose of @code is. Now, when you guys are writing Javadoc, I don't care if you use @code. Right? So for the purpose of this course, you don't have to put this in. Right? So if you just wanted to write round bracket 0.0, 0.0, it's fine. Just go ahead and do that. No one's going to take marks off your Javadoc if you do that. Right? If you're programming professionally and you're writing professional quality documentation, right, there is some responsibility that you format your documentation so that it's nicely readable. Right? Here, I'm not so concerned. Right? So if you don't like the @code, don't use it. Right? Okay, now some constructors have parameters, right? Most methods have parameters, right? So here's a constructor that takes in an x and a y value and sets the coordinates of that point to x and y, right? So the purpose of the constructor is it initializes the elements of this point, coordinates of this point, to x, y, right? Where x and y are specified by the caller, right? So these are parameters to the method, right? Whenever you have a parameter, right, after the description, right? So at the end of the Javadoc, you document each parameter and explain what is the purpose of that parameter. Right? The way you document the parameters is with this tag called @param. Anything with an @ in front of it is called a tag by Javadoc. Right? Javadoc interprets the tag and does something with it to generate the document. Right? So @param means you want to document a parameter. Right? So you put the name of the parameter, right? So @param space x, right? And then nothing after the x, right? No colon, no hyphen, right? No symbol after the x. Javadoc will insert a symbol for you. Right? And then describe very briefly what is the purpose of this parameter. Right? Well, x is the x value of the point. Right? I have a second parameter, so @param y. What's y? Well, it's the y value of this point. Right? When Javadoc generates the documentation, right? Down here, right? You get this parameter section, and it tells you that x is the x value of this point, and y is the y value of this point. Javadoc inserts the hyphen or a colon or some other symbol for you, depending on the version of Javadoc. Yes? No, so that's a good question, right? So the question is, so should you say that this is a double? The answer is no, because the type shows up right there, right? So one of the rules of writing good documentation is to avoid any redundancy, right? There's no point in saying that this is a double here, because the documentation already indicates up here that it's a double. Okay, let me jump ahead to a method. Yes, here's a method. Okay, so if you have a method that has parameters, then it's the same thing, right? You document each parameter with an @param tag. If you have a method that returns a value, you document the return value with an @return tag, right? So here's a method called set. Set takes in 2 parameters, and it returns a reference to a point to object. Right? So set sets the x and y coordinates of the point to the specified values. Right? So this is called new x and new y. So @param new x, that's the new x coordinate of the point. Right? There's a new y, so @param new y, that's the new y coordinate of the point. Right? And what does the method return? It returns a reference to this point. That lets you write p.set xy. That returns a reference to a point. So now you can write dot something else, can call some other method. Right? The point here being, if you have a return value on a method, there's an @return tag and a description of what the method actually returns. Where is, right? And so when you look at the generated documentation for set, right, there's a section here for the parameters, and there's a section here for the return value. Right? Again, you don't have to say what the type is here, because the type is right there. Right? So that's the type of the return value. Right? And so you just need to describe what value is returned by the method. And finally, if you have a method that throws an exception, right, or a constructor that throws an exception, right, then you document that exception with @throws. Right? Notice that there's a difference between @return, right, and @throws. Right? For some reason, they pluralized the throws, but they did not pluralize the return, right? I have no idea why. It's whoever invented the tool that made this decision. Okay, so this particular method here throws an illegal argument exception if the value is less than 0, right? So how do you document that? You document that with @throws, right? The next thing that comes is the type of exception that's thrown. So this is an illegal argument exception, so illegal argument exception appears here. Right? And the condition under which the exception is thrown. Right? So this method throws an exception if value is negative. Right? And that's it. So when you generate the documentation for that, right, there's a little section here that says what exceptions can be thrown by the method. Right? If your exception throws more than one type of method, you just put in multiple @throws. Right? So if there's many different types of exception, or if an illegal argument exception can be thrown by some other condition, you just put in another @throws tag and explain what exception is thrown under what condition. Right? Now for the assignment, it's pretty straightforward because your class is small. Right? Writing good documentation is very hard to do. Right? You can get a job programming professionally, and your job is basically writing documentation, right? There's no programming. You're just writing documentation. It's extremely hard to do. People who do it well are paid very well, right? But it is hard to do, right? So we're not expecting you to write like War and Peace in this course for your documentation, right? I just want you to know the mechanics for writing it, right? And so that's why on the assignment, you're told, look, you don't have to come up with your own text for everything here. Main method's just like any other method, right? So if you have a main method and you want to document it, it's just like documenting any other method, right? Explain why is there a main method, what does it do? If you use the input arguments, explain what the input arguments do. Okay, so I was saying, for the assignment, I'm not asking you to come up with the descriptions of everything on your own, right? I tell you, just go ahead and copy it straight out of the documentation document, right? Which is here, right? So inside the assignment, there's a link that takes you to the documentation that I've generated for the class, right? Your job here is to take the text that's in this document and basically get it into your code, right? So there's the description of the class, right? So you're going to go in, grab that, and copy it, right? So I'm just going to copy it directly. So I'm just going to Control-C, Command-C if you're on a Mac. Right? Go back to Eclipse. Here's my class. Right? Now, if you want to, you can put the Javadoc in manually. So / ***, right? Notice when you do that, it sticks in an author. You can leave it in. I don't care. I'm going to get rid of it. Control-V. There we go. I've just documented my class. Right? Easy peasy. Okay, you don't have to put in the Javadoc comment manually, right? So let me nuke that. Click on the line containing the class declaration, right? Go up to your source menu, right? And click Generate Element Comment, right? And it sticks in the comment for you, right? It's great because I can go to this method here, right, which returns a value. I can go source, generate element comment, and look, it puts in the return tag for me. Right? This one's got 2 inputs, so I can do the same thing. Click on the line containing the method, source, generate element comment, and hey, look, it puts the parameters and the return value for me. Right? So Eclipse will do all of this for you for free. Right? If you're doing this in like Visual Studio Code, well, you're kind of screwed. Right? You're going to have to type it all in manually. That's one of the reasons why I suggested you use Eclipse or some other IDE. Okay, so there's my comment for the class. Now what about the first method, init dictionary? Right? So you go back to your documentation. Right? You find your init dictionary method and you click on it. Whoops, and we go to here. Right? So that's the description for init dictionary. So you just copy that out. Control-C. Right, go back to Eclipse, paste it in. Right, now that's way too long. Right, so obviously you want to break this up so that the lines are like roughly 80 characters long. Again, Eclipse will do this for you. Source, format the element, and away you go. Right, so Eclipse will automatically format your code for you. Right, this includes the rest of your program. Right, if you go to source, format Shift Control F. On Mac, I think it's Shift Command F. It'll format all of your source code, including the comments for you in one shot. Right? It'll fix all your indenting, it'll fix all your white spacing for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Okay, so there we go. Right? There's my description. Right? If you want to generate the document exactly the way I did, you would put the ABC blah, 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 blah inside of an @code block. But I don't care. This is good. This is good enough. Okay, what about the return value? Go back to your documentation. Oh, sorry. Okay, right. What does it return? Well, it returns this stuff here. So grab that, copy that, plunk it into Eclipse. Like that. There you go. There's your first method documented. Right? Repeat for the second 2 methods, for the other 2 methods, and you're done the documentation for the class. Right? Remember when you document the parameter tags, There's no symbol after the variable name, right? So go back to Eclipse. Sorry, go back to the document. This is longest matching. Longest matching. So input is a string to look up in the specified dictionary. Go back here, right? Control V, right? There's no, right? One more time. There's no symbol here, right? Javadoc will insert the symbol for you. So there it is right there, right? Okay, so one more time for encode. Source, generate element comment, right? Inserts the Javadoc for you. All right, now if you want to test, have I written my documentation correctly, right? Go up to project, go to generate Javadoc, click on generate Javadoc, right? Go find the class that you want to document. So make sure it's checked over here, right? So I want to document the compress class, right? Go to next. Don't worry about this stuff here. You just click through next, right? And then click finish. It's going to add, oh, wait, sorry. I got to go back. Hang on just a second here. Hey. Oh, it's going to chug away. Okay, so project, generate Javadoc, find the class you want to document. Come on. Okay, make sure that's checked, right? Destination, so this is important, right? You need to specify, you need to tell Javadoc where should it write its documentation, right? So whatever this is, right, click browse and figure out where should it generate the documentation for, right? So I'm going to browse to a different directory because I really don't want it there, but it's there now. I'm going to put it in CISC124 temp. No, I'm not going to put it in temp. CISC124, oh yeah, CISC124, thank you. I need a, can I make a new folder? I need a new folder, sorry. New folder, ABC. I'm just going to put it there, right? You put whatever you want. Right? And then finish. It's going to ask you, do you want to update Javadoc, blah, 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 blah. You can click yes or no, it doesn't matter, right? Okay, now the tool's going to chug, right? You want to look for any warnings or errors, right? This is saying warning, no description for @param dict, right? So it's complaining this is empty, it's complaining that's empty, it's complaining that's empty, it's complaining that's empty, right? You want to avoid, when you generate your Javadoc, you don't want to see any warnings, right? I'm not going to fix it now. Okay, once you've generated the Javadoc, just go into your directory. Here. Yes, CISC124, ABC, right? Look for index.html. Right? No, index.html. Double click. Hey, there we go. There's compress. Click on compress. There's our Javadoc, right? Notice it doesn't look exactly the same as the correct document. Right? The correct document's got stuff for everything, right? Right? But it's there, right? So if you really want to check, did you write your Javadoc correctly, just run it through the Javadoc tool. It's not required that you check on the assignment. Okay, I'm out of time. That should get you done for assignment 3. Anybody have any questions for me regarding the assignment or today's lecture material? Okay, cool. All right, I'll see you next Monday.